Today, Norwich is the 31st largest British settlement by population and is home to a bustling art scene, a world-renowned university and the picturesque Norfolk Broads. But how did all this start? How did Norwich become Norwich? Well, let's go back in time. Modern humans first settled in what is today Norfolk around 20,000 years ago. Archaeological discoveries show that the early human settlers primarily engaged in farming, having moved on from the hunter-gatherer lifestyles into more organised communities. Ancient burial mounds were constructed, and large-scale farming operations and the rise of local villages indicate an increasingly complex societal structure. And there was one tribe that flourished more than the others, the Iceni tribe. The Iceni were the first culture to dominate Norfolk, and Celtic culture was widespread. The Iceni would trade with other tribes of Celtic Britain, but were mostly self-sufficient, relying predominantly on agriculture, animal husbandry, and pottery crafting to survive. Recent archaeological discoveries have found complex burial rituals, including cremation and inhumation. The Iceni enjoyed many years of domination over the East Anglian area. That is, until the Romans arrived. When the Romans landed in Britain, led by Emperor Claudius, everything changed for the Celtic tribes. The technological superiority of the Romans couldn't be questioned, and the woefully unprepared settlements surrendered quickly. History is slightly patchy here, but what we do know is that King Prasutagus came to some form of arrangement with the Romans in 47 AD, and for the next 13 years, things stayed relatively calm. However, the Roman stranglehold on Britannia only grew stronger, and the occupiers began to demand an ever-increasing amount in trade and tribute. After the Roman conquests, the Celtic tribes of Britannia were suppressed by the invaders, turning the regions of the Iceni into a dependency. After the death of Prasutagus, the Iceni king, the Romans allegedly reneged on any agreement they made with him, directly annexing his territory before having his daughters flogged, raped, and murdered. This led to one of Rome's greatest tests on their hold over Britannia, Boudicca's rebellion. The Romans seized the land of the Iceni and placed it under the direct control of Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, and he and his small force of soldiers began reshaping the region into a more Roman vision. Naturally, the Iceni were not happy about having their land stolen, so they took up arms and marched on Londinium. Initially, the rebellion went incredibly well, with the Iceni taking key victories at Camulodonium, modern-day Colchester, Varulanium, modern-day St Albans, and Londinium, modern-day London. All the fledgling towns were sacked and torched. More troops were sent to Britannia to crush the rebellion. The Romans were outnumbered in their response, but their organisation and technical superiority to the Britannic tribes turned the tide. Roman sources claim that 80,000 Britons died in the rebellion, which would have been a good chunk of the population at that time, and most of them were from modern-day East Anglia. We don't know exactly what happened to Boudicca, but most sources seem to conclude that she died sometime before the end of her rebellion. The date and location of the final battle is unclear, but what we do know is it was a death blow for Boudicca's forces, and signalled the end of the rebellion. The Roman response to the uprising was to build a town where I'm stood right now. There's not much left of it, as you can see. But it was Venta Icenorum, translating to market of the Iceni. And the Romans were pragmatic, and they knew that a lighter touch would be needed if they were going to prevent further uprisings in the future, and to collaborate with the tribes, with the locals. The town featured residential homes, a marketplace, shops, workshops, prayer facilities, a public forum, and Roman baths. Like most things Roman, the town collapsed in the end, and it remained abandoned for centuries. It wasn't until the 1920s that historians and architects who were looking for Britain's Celtic past discovered this place. Excavations have found building structures, precious artifacts, and clues as to how life was lived in Roman Britain. As Roman influence declined and eventually vanished, the Dark Ages were ushered in. The population declined, living standards fell, and connections with other civilizations were non-existent. By the end of the 5th century, Germanic tribes were beginning to arrive en masse to the region, most notably the Angles and the Saxons. So they began to build new settlements. Located on the River Wensum, the villages of Northwick and Westwick were constructed. The villages became prominent trade hubs, eventually merging and expanding even more to become the town of Norwich, a key economic centre for the Kingdom of East Anglia, one of the 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would later merge to become the Kingdom of England. The Anglo-Saxon era will bring the Christianisation of the region, growing trade through the River Wensum with the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the emerging provinces of Europe, and also, of course, with the Danelaw. Speaking of the Vikings, the Kingdom of East Anglia collapsed and its territories were absorbed into the Danelaw, and became a launching point for Viking invasions of Wessex and Northumbria, which dominated the next century. After a series of defeats in Essex, Chelmsford and Northampton, the former Kingdom of East Anglia was absorbed by the Kingdom of Wessex and the Danes were repelled from the island. The Vikings would eventually return under Canute the Great and would rule all of England until the Danelaw lost control to Edward the Confessor in 1042. Time continued to go by and William did some conquering. Norwich and Norfolk as a whole were relatively unbothered by the whole affair, being reasonably far away from all the action. Into William's later reign, however, the most visually striking aspect of Norman conquest found its way to Norwich: architecture. This included villages, farms, forts, and castles. This is Norwich Castle, one of the oldest standing castles in the UK, built by the Normans after William the Conqueror became King of England. Now, the main keep of the castle is currently undergoing a multi-million-pound restoration to put it back to its former glory. But I've managed to get a look around the museum and I've managed to get a conversation with someone who knows a thing or two about the history of this castle. Come on, let's go. Why was Norwich Castle built in the first place?
So we know that Norwich was a really strategically important part, and very soon after William the Conqueror's success at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he obviously quickly identified Norwich as somewhere that he wished to exert his power and his influence as the new ruling king.
What kind of status did Norwich Castle enjoy amongst other palaces in the UK as well as Europe at that time?
So when it was first constructed, it was one of the most impressive buildings in medieval Europe, and that's because it was part of the royal estate, part of King Henry I's royal palaces. So, you know, it's up there. It's one of only 3 built in stone in those very early years of the Norman dynasty. So here, Colchester Castle and the White Tower at London, part of the Tower of London. So, you know, a really impressive construction, a really important building.
What are you hoping to achieve with the restoration?
So our Norwich Castle Royal Palace Reborn is really about putting back the castle front and centre to our museum. It's such an impressive building. When you walk up to visit the museum, the castle stone keep is at the front and centre. But before our redevelopment, you very much lost the keep. Often the stone keep, which had seemed so impressive as you approached, was kind of lost. And if you did go into our castle keep, you very much found a museum within a castle. What we're looking to do with Norwich Castle Royal Palace Reborn project is really restore that castle tale, to be able to tell those stories, and to do that we're reinstating the original Norman floor levels as they would have been 900 years ago when Norwich Castle was first built as a royal palace for the Norman kings.
Norwich Castle wasn't the only major construction project undertaken by the Normans in the city. Norwich Cathedral began construction in 1096 and took approximately 50 years to complete. When the spire was finished, it was the tallest building in East Anglia. The textile industry became one of the most well-respected in Europe, mainly for its competitive prices and high quality. The Domesday Book indicates that Norwich was home to around 5,000 to 10,000 people in 1086, and this had increased to around 20,000 to 25,000 in the early 14th century, as people flocked to Norwich for job opportunities away from rural squalor. But the Black Death came with them, halving the city's population in just over a year. The recovery from the epidemic was slow, but Norwich kept its status as a crucial trade city. The city walls were built across the Middle Ages and confirmed Norwich's status as an important city that required defensive structures. And defensive structures were needed. In the early 16th century, as the Protestant Reformation and Enlightenment swept over Europe, merchants and peasants alike were demanding greater rights from their local lords. And one local landowner decided enough was enough. His name was Robert Kett. Initially, he only sought to petition the local lords in protest against the enclosure of public lands. Upon their denial, Kett's cause grew, and before the nobility knew it, he had an army, and it was marching on Norwich.
After the initial march on Norwich, Kett's men settled here at Hold Heath, a strategic point which overlooks the city. At this point in time, Norwich was the second largest city in England, so having a rebel force on the outskirts of a symbol of English power could not be tolerated for long. For the time the rebels were at Mousehold Heath, Kett set up base here, St Michael's Chapel, which has come to have many distinctive names over the years, such as Kett's Castle, or as it's known now, Kett's Heights. It was here where Kett and his co-conspirators drew up a list of grievances they intended to put to the king, such as demands for greater rights for the peasantry and merchant classes, land reforms, and fairer rents. These were denied, and the rebellion would gain further steam. On the 22nd of July, the rebels stormed the city, defeating its defenders. Civic leaders such as the mayor were imprisoned in Mousehold Heath, and the rebels again issued their demands for reform, this time from a heightened position of power.
After hearing the news of the city's fall, the king sent the Marquess of Northampton to retake Norwich. He turned up with 1,400 men to find the rebels had withdrawn back to Mousehold Heath. While Northampton's men were making defensive preparations, the rebels began their assault. Upon receiving news the rebels wished to surrender, Northampton sent Lord Sheffield to attempt a negotiation with Robert Kett, only for him to find it had been a diversion, as the rebels had crossed the River Wensum and were attacking through the eastern side of the city and into the marketplace. Despite being trained soldiers, the sheer number of rebels overwhelmed the smaller force, and Sheffield was killed after falling from his horse. Northampton was forced to withdraw in a humiliating blow to the royal forces.
After the failed attempt by Northampton to retake the city, the Earl of Warwick showed up with 14,000 men at his command, including paid mercenaries from Germany. By the end of August, the rebels had been forced out of the city. In their retreat, they burnt everything in their path to try and stop the army's advance, but didn't work. However, they did manage to steal some artillery, which they brought back with them here to Mousehold Heath.
In one last roll of the dice, the rebels attempted to retake the city, using the artillery they'd captured. The rebels entered the north side of the city through the damaged gates, and intense street-to-street fighting commenced, but it led to nothing for the rebels, who were forced to retreat once again.
In spite of their best efforts, the rebels were defeated for the final time. It's not entirely certain where the final battle took place, although it's likely around Dussindale, which is just east of here. It's believed 3,000 of the rebels died at Dussindale, plus an unknown number captured and hanged, while only 250 of Warwick's army died. As for Robert Kett, he was captured the night after the battle, tried and found guilty for treason, and then hung from the walls of Norwich Castle.
Kett's rebellion was a failure, but it wasn't the end of the cause he fought for. Eventually, things began to change under Elizabeth I, who granted concessions to the landowners, seeing the growing threat of a Franco-Spanish alliance as more important than debates over minor land reforms. Still, divisions would remain into the 17th century, and support for the new Stuart monarchy would decline in the following decades. As it happened, support for the Stuarts declined nationwide and culminated in the English Civil War. Norwich, being mostly made up of traders and merchants, many of whom were puritanical, sided heavily with the parliamentarians against the royalists, and the city's defences were renovated, including a major upgrade to Norwich Castle, which was still a critical defensive position. Despite battles at Colchester and Stowmarket, Norwich never saw the war arrive at the city walls, and it ended with a parliamentarian victory. The Crown and the Church of England were eventually restored. As the Georgian era was ushered in, the city's landscape began to change rapidly, as townhouses, public buildings, roads and bridges were constructed to meet the demands of an ever-growing population, most of whom were working in textile development and later clockmaking. The Theatre Royal also opened its doors in 1758, paving the way for Norwich's reputation for being a city closely associated with the arts. New industries including metalwork, engineering and railway construction boosted the city's diversifying economic sector, with Norwich producing metals for mechanisms such as engines, trains and modern weaponry. Speaking of modern weaponry, in 1914 an Austrian was shot in Bosnia, and within a month Europe set itself on fire. The war itself had a fundamental impact on Norwich, with many men going to fight and die on the continent. At the war's conclusion, 3,544 men from Norwich had died in the fighting, the vast majority serving in the Norfolk Regiment, the Second World War. Despite never being fought on British soil, found its way to Norwich in multiple ways, including the Baedeker Blitz in 1942. On the 27th of April, Norwich was heavily targeted by the Luftwaffe and suffered extensive bombing, which damaged Norwich Cathedral, much of the Old Town and Marketplace, and caused at least 500 fatalities, with many more injured. In 1945, the war ended and peace was restored, and Norwich, like the rest of the UK, had to rebuild. Norwich Cathedral underwent its latest renovation in its long and storied history, and the Old Town was restored to its original condition. However, one thing was missing. Something which had been planned for decades, but always interrupted by global affairs. Norwich had long been a haven for education and boasted many enlightened minds over the centuries, yet had never played host to a university. In the early 1960s, this changed.
UEA began life here at Earlham Hall in the early 60s as a new wave of universities were being constructed around the UK. The main campus had not finished building until the late 1960s, so this was the temporary university. The main campus itself wasn't completed until the late 60s, but the university was greatly expanded when it was. Other noticeable landmarks include the distinctive ziggurat buildings, which overlook the Norfolk Broads. Further additions to the campus have continued over time, such as the Sainsbury's Centre, which has become a national hub for art, something that's intertwined with Norwich's history. UEA has, in many ways, become the beating heart of Norwich, with students all over the world falling in love with this city. UEA has helped contribute to the growing prosperity of Norwich, as it underwent the transition from fading market town to bustling university city. I hope this documentary has helped uncover the history of this city. From ancient times to modern, something always seems to be happening. There never seems to be a dull moment in this part of the world. I guess that's why they call Norwich the City of Stories.